Yeah, I love that, and I talk about it in the book, that French medic who talked about the best time to have sex is after your first sleep, when you'll not only enjoy it more, be better at it. And I couldn't resist putting that one in the book.
The Doctor's Kitchen podcast is with Professor Russel Foster. We're talking about everything to do with circadian rhythms, the rough 24-hour cycle by which all organisms operate on. And you're going to learn all about why it's so important for your physiology, as well as the 10 different things that Professor Russel Foster recommends that people do to entrain their circadian rhythm for the betterment of their brain, their heart, and even things like how well we respond to supplements and drugs. You're going to love this episode, and if you want to check out his book Lifetime, it is down below in the captions. Plus, whilst you're there, check out my newsletter, Eat, Read, Listen, where every week I send you something to eat, something to read, something to listen that will help you live a healthier, happier life. On to our chat. Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. Great. Professor, it's so lovely to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time.
I'm really delighted to join you, Rupi. Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat to you about this. As you know, sleep is almost having a bit of a renaissance. I think we're all becoming a lot more aware about how important it is to make sure that we're getting enough of it. But I wanted to start by getting into a bit about your history and how you started studying and sleep and why this has become sort of your area of expertise.
Well, it goes back quite some way, actually. I mean, frighteningly, to undergraduate years. I was always fascinated with clocks, how they're regulated by light. And of course, one of the most obvious of our 24-hour rhythms is the sleep-wake rhythm, rhythm. So in a sense, they all sort of blended together. But in fact, if we go right back, to the early years, I was sort of remedial in classes. I used to sort of sit in my own little bubble, and my parents were, absolutely despairing, because I remember the headmaster. I was a good swimmer, and I just sort of, captained this sort of swimming team, and the headmaster came, gave me this cup, and he said to my parents, at the same time, of course, you do realise Russell is an entirely non-academic child, and so, and it's fascinating, sort of, and then I sort of fell into this groove of neuroscience, and loving, all this sort of science, and then realised, well, perhaps if I really want to continue in this way, I ought to sort of pull my finger out and actually pay attention in class. And it was just like a light bulb moment, because it went from being, in the bottom of the class in a low sort of stream to the top of the top stream. And it's weird. However, to answer your question, getting into sleep specifically, there was another pivotal moment. I was in a lift with a psychiatrist in a hospital in West London, where I used to work before Oxford, and this chap said to me, "Oh, my patients with schizophrenia, they don't have a job, so they go to bed late, get up late, miss my clinic, and don't have friends." And I was really irritated by that, and I thought that just doesn't make any sense to me. And so we teamed up with another psychiatrist, and we started to look systematically at the sleep-wake rhythms of these individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And these rhythms were so completely and utterly smashed. There was no 24-hour sort of rhythmicity in some of these individuals. And that really fascinated me. I mean, and so many of the problems that these individuals were having, cognitive problems, health problems, were probably as a result of the appalling sleep that they were experiencing. And so really that was the trigger that got me into human research, and indeed specifically sleep and the abnormal patterns of sleep in mental illness, which we've continued to work on really for the past, almost 20 years.
When you told that story in your book, actually, I went to Imperial, so I know Charing Cross Hospital well, and the lifts that are really unreliable as well in that
Absolutely.
building. Unfortunately,
Well,
I don't think they've updated it. It's really a need.
no, I think we had an external examiner coming in to examine a PhD. I think they were stuck in the lift for about an hour. We thought, oh my goodness, they probably, there's probably some transport issue. No, they were banging on the doors of the lift trying to get out.
Yeah, crazy. It brought back so many memories as a medical student for me, actually, when you told that story. I think why don't we anchor the listener with a couple of definitions, because I think circadian rhythm is going to come up quite a bit,
Yeah,
the sleep-wake cycle. So maybe we can establish exactly what we mean by those terms and the definitions, and then we can go into how that applies to a fascinating area of mental well-being, as well as all the other areas as well that can affect.
sure. So I think it's quite remarkable. We have an internal biological day, often called the body clock, and also called circadian rhythms. And what these circadian rhythms represent is essentially a biological process which produces a cycle of around about 24 hours. Now, it's not exactly 24 hours. In fact, circadian rhythm means about 24 hours. And so in addition to this internal representation of a day, we also need to set that day to the external world. And the most important factor for for aligning the internal and the external day is exposure to the light-dark cycle. So that's the core of our circadian rhythms. Often talk about a sleep-wake. We often talk about a sleep-wake cycle. And of course, that's the most obvious of our 24-hour rhythms. But the sleep-wake cycle is more than just the circadian system. The circadian system times a whole bunch of processes within the brain. In fact, the sleep-wake flip-flop from consciousness to sleep is extraordinary. It involves a realignment of all the key brain neurotransmitter systems and multiple brain structures all interacting. And this flip-flop between the two states is then timed by the clock, the circadian system, which says now's the appropriate time to be awake, now is the appropriate time to be asleep. But there's yet another timer for the sleep-wake cycle, which is probably the most intuitive part about sleep, which is called the homeostatic drive or sleep pressure. And what that represents is essentially the longer you've been awake, the greater the buildup of sleep pressure and the greater the need for sleep. So what happens is that first thing in the morning, the clock has woken you up, ideally, your biological clock, not your alarm clock, and sleep pressure builds throughout the day, and it's really high towards sleep. And we don't fall asleep because the clock is saying, no, it's daytime, keep awake, keep awake, keep awake. And in fact, the highest drive from the clock for wakefulness is just before we fall asleep, because it's counteracting that build-up of sleep pressure throughout the day. So we have these wonderful timers all interacting to flip-flop us between consciousness and the sleep state.
So we have this rough 24-hour cycle that we operate on. We have sleep pressure. I think that's a really important concept as well for people to understand as it builds throughout the whole day and affects our rhythm. How do we entrain this rhythm such that it's consistent and actually in line with how we should be working with the day and night cycles?
Well, of course, Rupi, that's one of my favourite questions, because that's where I've spent a lot of my time researching. And in fact, we knew that in humans, and in fact all mammals, the eye is critical for detecting the dawn-dusk cycle to set the internal clock. But it always puzzled me, because if you think about the visual system, what the visual system does is grab light in a fraction of a second and then forget it's seen it. So we're talking about light sensing in the millisecond, the sub-second range. But the clock doesn't need information like that. It needs a sort of a global measure of light intensity around about dawn and dusk. And I couldn't work out how the classical visual system was grabbing light to regulate internal time. So we started working on mice with hereditary retinal disorders. They had gene defects which had rendered their rods and cones, the visual cells within the eye, it had just effectively turned them off. And in fact, these are really interesting animal models because they were being used at the time to understand the genetics of human eye disease. So these animals existed, and we put them into little running wheels, and we hooked up the running wheels to a computer, and we just measured their rest activity cycles. And what was truly remarkable, and I still get a tingle when I think about these early observations, is that these mice were visually blind. They simply showed no visual response at all, and yet they regulated their clock, their circadian system, to the light-dark cycle perfectly. They showed that they could not only entrain, but they did so with the same sensitivity as a mouse with all of its rods and cones. And I remember when I first presented these data, actually at a vision meeting, I said, so the data are consistent with the fact that there's another light sensor within the eye. And the consternation in response to this heresy was extraordinary. I mean, one talk I gave, and a chap stood up at the back of the auditorium, and I thought he was sort of interrupting to ask a question, so I sort of paused. And he just looked at me and shouted bullshit and walked out. And another person I remember was absolutely infuriated. They said, do you think after 150 years of research on the eye, all of us here have missed a completely new photoreceptor system? Of course, I was quite young in my career and quite bullish. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but yes, you have. And so, I mean, but as you know, it's never black and white. And so there was a grain of truth in the criticism, which was, okay, there could be just a few visual cells, rods and cones, left within the eye, regulating the circadian system. And so what we then did was genetically engineer a mouse where all the rods and all the cones had been absolutely turned off. There was no way that they could signal at all. And those mice were just like the other mice. They showed perfectly normal circadian entrainment to the light-dark cycle. And that then led to the realization that there's another light-sensing cell, and in fact it's based upon the ganglion cells within the retina. Now the ganglion cells are wonderful because they have their axons, and those axons form the optic nerve. They're the last layer in the retina, and they project off into the brain. And what we were able to show in the mouse, working closely with my colleague Mark Hankins, and David Burson was able to show in the rat, is that a small number of these ganglion cells are directly light sensitive. They are photosensitive retinal ganglion cells using a completely new light sensing molecule or photopigment that we showed that was maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum. So it's a great example where really completely curiosity driven research has resulted in an extraordinary finding. And in fact, it's changed our view of the eye. We now appreciate that the eye is an organ of space. It gives us our sense of space through vision, but it's also an organ of time because of its ability to regulate the internal clock. And indeed, it's to some extent redefining our understanding of blindness. You can be visually blind because you've lost your, let's say, visual cells, your rods and cones, but you can still be able to regulate the clock by light because you've got those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And so, yes, it's been really exciting. And in fact, what we're up to at the moment with my colleagues is trying to understand how those novel photosensitive retinal ganglion cells actually interact with the molecular clockwork. And we've produced actually some quite exciting stuff over the past couple of years. And I've got, as all, when you talk to other scientists, say, oh, my best paper's just around the corner. You know, we're actually working on this new paper, which we hope to submit fairly shortly. And by understanding those pathways in, what we can also do is think about drugs that will interact with key nodes in that pathway that will then fool the clock that it's seen light. So I work very closely with Blind Veterans UK, these extraordinary individuals who, as a result of trauma, have lost their eyes in combat, and so they have no eyes. And so they drift through time completely. And the work that we're doing on mice, and now in early stage human trials, we think we'll be able to give back a sense of time to these individuals because we will fool their biological clock that it's seen light. And I think that's so cool. If I can finish my career by giving back a sense of time to those individuals, and in fact, it relates to a bigger population because sleep-wake rhythms are smashed in mental illness, neurodevelopmental diseases, and other conditions which are very, very difficult. I mean, some childhood illnesses, for example, where there's no sense of time. And so there's a thought that perhaps we can use these drugs, which are originally being developed for the blind, but in other clinical cases as well, whereby we can consolidate sleep-wake, and then maybe short-term use of these drugs, and then move on to light and other agents. So yeah, it's a really exciting time because we're developing new drugs to help individuals.
I wanted to ask about, okay, so now we have this idea of the visual system being very important in training the sleep-wake cycle. How does this interact with the quote-unquote master clock? And how does that filter down into all the other elements, the organs, our pancreas, our digestive system, etc., etc.? But I thought we'd focus on the master clock
Yeah.
first.
So we actually have a physical structure deep within the brain, within the hypothalamus, that represents a master clock. It's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. It's a paired structure either side of where the optic nerves go into the brain and fuse. And so it sits right at the base of the brain. And there were rumbles that this bit of the brain was very important in circadian organization. Studies going back to the 20s and 30s identified something within the base of the brain, because when that part of the brain was destroyed, these 24-hour activity patterns that rats and mice were showing were lost. So there was some stuff going down there. I was involved actually with some experiments with Martin Ralph in University of Virginia and Mike Menneker, but Martin led these experiments showing that you could actually destroy that little bit of the brain in a mouse. Well, actually, it wasn't a mouse, it was a hamster. And I can tell you why it was a hamster later on. But anyway, it was this hamster. And then transplant in an SCN from another hamster. But it was a mutant hamster. So instead of having a clock of about 24 hours, it had a clock of about 20 hours. And what was truly remarkable is that mutant SCN actually restored rhythms to the host where the SCN had been lesioned, but with a period of 20 hours. And that was just so cool because, here we have, you've transplanted an essential element of the clock, which is its period. And so further work went on, and it was discovered by other groups that you could take one of those individual clock cells out, and there's about 50,000 in a human SCN, and it would tick away in a dish. It would show 24-hour oscillations, and that was immensely exciting. And then it became clear how that clock was actually generated. Now, it wasn't originally shown in mammals at all. It was shown in the fruit fly. And in fact, in 2017, I was lucky enough to see my colleagues, Rosbash, Hall and Young, get the Nobel Prize for discovering how the clock ticked in fruit flies. And of course, in essence, what you've got is a bunch of clock genes which encode proteins. Those proteins then form a complex which move into the nucleus and turn off their own genes. That complex then gets degraded. The genes can then turn on again. So you've got this extraordinary feedback loop, a molecular feedback loop. And so more recently, it's been shown that subtle changes in some of those clock genes can either speed up the clock or slow the clock down. And so part of whether you're a morning person or an evening person or somebody in the middle is actually due to how fast your clock runs, which is in turn related to subtle changes in some of those genes that are part of the molecular clockwork. Okay, so we have this master clock within the brain, these molecular clocks ticking away. It's regulated by the eye and the light-dark cycle. And what we thought was that the SCN then imposed 24-hour rhythms on activity, whether it was the hormonal systems, whether it was the digestive enzymes, whether it was liver function, muscle function. We just assumed it was a signal from the master clock imposing these rhythms. And then Uli Schibler did some amazing experiments, and I was in the audience when these data were first presented, and he showed that other cells in the body had clocks, and they were ticking in a way that was just like those clocks within the SCN. And from that early observation, it became clear that essentially every cell in the body has the capacity to generate its own 24-hour molecular oscillation. And so our concept of the circadian system changed almost overnight from an SCN forcing rhythmicity on the rest of the body to a system more akin to an orchestra, where you have the conductor of the orchestra, the SCN, producing a rhythmic temporal beat from which the members of the orchestra, the cells in the body, take a reference cue and align their rhythmicity in alignment with the master clock. So we've moved from saying the circadian system to this sort of circadian network, which is what's generating our 24-hour biology, including, of course, the sleep-wake cycle. So it's been a really exciting time, and I do feel that this sort of work is one of the great achievements in biology. I mean, to simply understand how genes and their protein products can interact to generate complex behavior and contribute to so much of our embedded biology, I think is an extraordinary achievement. And I think, Rosbash, Hall and Young deserved their Nobel Prize, absolutely, for getting this sorted out, not in us, of course, but in flies. But that then informed how the molecular clock is working across the animal kingdom. I mean, what's also extraordinary is that the way that a fly generates its circadian rhythm, its genes and those proteins, are broadly similar to the sorts of things ticking away in you and I. So the whole of the animal lineage is ticking away using genes and proteins which are broadly similar. And what's fascinating, of course, is that the different groups, the plants, for example, the bacteria, they also have clocks, but they're built slightly differently. So it's likely that circadian rhythms have evolved more than once using different sorts of symptoms. They all are based upon a feedback loop, but they're using different genes and different proteins to achieve that oscillation.
Yeah, that point actually leads me nicely on to the more broader question about why we sleep. I mean, to echo your point, I think if you think about the ramifications of sleep, more generally, absolutely, that Nobel Prize was really well deserved because we have a deeper understanding about how it affects everything from mental health, hormonal health, digestive health, metabolic health, obesity, all the things that I do want to talk to you about in a minute. But when it comes to just how deeply ingrained sleep's importance is to organisms from across the lineage of different animals. I mean, it is pretty incredible that we do sleep, considering I know we don't think about it now as a useless activity, but certainly it's not very convenient, is it? Considering our previous environment where we would have had to fight off predators and it would have been a
Yeah.
very hostile place to live.
Okay, well, there's a story here. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper which is essentially, why we sleep. And in fact, I rather provocatively entitled it, "There is no mystery to sleep." And what I'm about to tell you is my theory of why we sleep. And it isn't universally accepted, although there is creeping acceptance to it, which is quite pleasing. So
Okay.
the first question goes back to circadian rhythms. Why has almost all life on the planet evolved a pattern of activity and rest, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's an amoeba, whether it's, I don't know, an okapi, anything. It's got this activity of activity and rest. So to no animal, no organism spans the light-dark cycle equally effectively. What it's done is evolve specializations that allow it to function optimally either at night, during the day, or sometimes during that transition period. You think about it, animals that are exquisitely adapted to the nighttime fail rather miserably. They usually become somebody's lunch if they're active during the daytime, and vice versa. So once you've made the evolutionary decision to be either day active or night active, you then have to decide, well, what are you going to do with those two temporal periods? And my view is that essentially what evolution has done is allocate key aspects of our biology to the appropriate phase of the rest activity cycle. So for us, for example, if we've accumulated all this massive information during the day, we then, when we go to sleep, we then start to play with that information. We say, are we going to turn this into memory? Are we going to start to problem solve? And in a sense, the brain's then got the capacity. It's not being flooded with new information. It can say, okay, how can I deal with the information I've acquired during the day? In the same way, when we're active, we're building up a mass of toxins. And we don't want to keep on flipping backwards and forwards between generating them and packaging them up and all the rest of it. We store them and then we package them up efficiently and we get rid of them at night. And we should come back to the clearance of toxins in the brain later on. So my definition of sleep is as follows, which is it's a period of physical inactivity. It's a period of physical inactivity which prevents us moving around an environment to which we're poorly adapted, but during which time we've allocated a whole mass of essential biology. Essentially, we've compartmentalized our biology in time, allocating it to the most efficient part of our rest activity cycle. So there's not one overarching reason for sleep. It's essentially a whole bunch of critical biology that goes on at the most appropriate time. So that's my definition of sleep.
Okay, that totally makes sense. I think particularly when as people will recognize when they read your book or watch your lectures, the important processes that occur during sleep. It's a necessary component of just living, and that like you said, we'll talk about clearing of toxins during the rest period. Are there examples of other organisms or mammals where they have a more efficient sleep period? Because 30 to 35% of our life is going to be spent in sleep. Do you think we could have become a bit more sort of evolved, so a bit more efficiency, so it's a less of a proportion of our 24-hour cycle, 24-hour day?
I think there's huge diversity across the animal world with durations of sleep and what's going on. And I think it's that evolutionary balance. You sleep long enough to do the sorts of things that you need to do. In some sense, I think it's surprising that we don't sleep more, because so much of our memory consolidation and information processing is going on whilst we sleep. And we survive because of this extraordinary great structure on the top of our, on the top of our head. It's worth bearing in mind that 20% of all the calories we consume are burnt by the energy going on within the brain, which is 2 to 3% of body weight. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And of course, sleep is this amazing defender of brain function. I mean, and in fact, you could argue that sleep is the best cognitive enhancer that we've got. Certainly better than any drugs we might want to take. And so I think that the period of sleep that animals and we experience is what's needed to underpin our biology. But there are some very interesting issues about what goes on during sleep. So part of the reason for writing Lifetime, I have to say, was because I was somewhat irritated with the sergeant majors of sleep screaming, you must get 8 hours, you must do this and you must do that. And I thought, this is nonsense. I mean, if we think about sleep, it's a dynamic, very, very different bit of biology, not only between individuals, but also as we age. So, for example, sleep duration. If we look at the healthy range of sleep in adults, it's somewhere between 6 hours and it may be up to 10 hours. And the average, of course, is 7 or 8 hours. But by telling people they must get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, it can then generate enormous anxiety. I remember before lockdown, a chap came up to me and said, I'm not getting 8 hours of sleep. Am I going to die? And I said, well, you know, I can guarantee that you're going to die, but it's not necessarily because you're not getting 8 hours of sleep. And so I think it's wonderful that we're all much more aware of the importance of sleep, but it's also bred a certain level of anxiety. And one of the points of the book is to arm individuals with the science and a whole bunch of sort of suggestions that they can adopt or not to get the sleep that they would require. And I think that the key thing is that we all have to ask ourselves, well, how much sleep do I need? Am I getting the right sort of sleep? And it's not rocket science. Basically, do you feel that during the day you're able to function at an optimal level? Are you able to perform the tasks that you need to perform at a level that you're happy with? That's the key area. But also, I think you can get a suggestion about whether you're sleeping sufficiently by asking, well, do I need an alarm clock to wake me up in the morning, or somebody else? Do I oversleep extensively on free days, like the weekend, and particularly when I go away on holiday? Does it take me a long time to wake up? Do I feel groggy? Is there lots of sleep inertia? Do I feel irritable, tired, and fatigued when I'm awake? Do I crave a nap during the day? Do I use caffeinated drinks to drive the wake state throughout the day? And do my friends, families, and colleagues say you're more irritable, you're showing loss of empathy, and you're doing stupid and unreflective things? Now, if it's no to all of that, you're probably getting the sleep that you need. And so I think we should flip it around and we should say, well, what's my daytime functioning like? And if it's okay, I'm probably getting the sleep that I need. Another real myth that really irritates me is this concept of the 8-hour uninterrupted block of sleep. Now, there's studies which I think are absolutely fascinating, records from the pre-industrial era showing what human sleep patterns are like. And so there was a sort of a 2-hour winding down, then sleep, may then wake up for a short period of time, interact with others, go back to sleep, and then have a slow transition out. You see that in societies today without electric light. And in fact, if you or I were taken into the lab, given 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness, again, we would flip into a pattern where we would have 1 or 2 wake episodes in the middle of the night. And this is called biphasic sleep, 2 episodes of sleep separated by wake, or indeed polyphasic sleep, which is sleep separated by several wake-ups. And that's probably the natural state. And people don't know that. And so if you wake up in the middle of the night, you think, oh my God, that's it. I'm never going to get back to sleep. I'm not getting my 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, which is what the sergeant majors are screaming at me. Get stressed, start drinking coffee, start doing emails without staying calm, thinking this is probably a normal pattern of my biology. I can stay here. If I'm feeling tired, I'll flop back to sleep, or I'll go to another room, keep the lights low, listen to a piece of relaxing music or a few pages of a favorite novel, feeling tired, then go back to bed. And so I think this is really important that we appreciate that sleep is very changeable, very dynamic between individuals and as we age.
Yeah, I think the dynamism of sleep is something that's really important to emphasize because you're right. I certainly have come across a lot of people who have become quite anxious the more they learn about sleep. And to draw an analogy, I think it's similar to, people who don't feel like they're eating enough fruits and vegetables, or they're eating too much junk food and they get anxious every time they hear or see something that associates junk food consumption with early deaths or dementia, et cetera, or sugar consumption. So I think there's definitely a fine balance to strike there. And it's very interesting. You note that in some of those details of pre-industrial times, or even some novels where they mention first sleep and second sleep. And that was a revelation to me. I thought it was super interesting. I hadn't come across that before.
Yeah, I love that, and I talk about it in the book, that French medic who talked about the best time to have sex is after your first sleep, when you'll not only enjoy it more, be better at it. And I just couldn't resist putting that one in the book.
Yeah, that was brilliant. And you mentioned different people are better at getting up at different times. And I wanted to ask you about chronotypes and how you can tell if there are practical ways, in the same way you've just laid out, how you can practically tell whether you're sleeping enough. Just a note on that, I think most people listening to this will probably have answered to at least 1 or 2 of those things that you mentioned in the list of attributes for people who aren't getting enough sleep. But with the chronotypes, how can you tell whether practically you are a morning lark
Yeah.
or a night owl?
So about 10% of the population would be early types, larks. About 65 of us are sort of intermediate types, often called doves. I mentioned this the other day, and I called them pigeons. I don't know why I called people. Anyway, it's doves. And the last group are the late types, which are the owls, and that's about 25% of the population. So there's a sort of a skewing to more later types, but it's broadly speaking a bell-shaped curve. And so what's generating our chronotype? And there's three essential factors. One is our genes. So we touched on this slightly earlier when we talked about the clock. Subtle changes in the molecular clockwork are associated with morningness versus eveningness. So by their contribution to our genes, I guess, our parents are still telling us what time to get up and go to bed. The second is I think, really interesting, and it depends upon our age. So from about the age of 10, we start to go to bed, or want to go to bed, later and later and later. And that peaks in males in their early 20s, 21 or so. It peaks in women at about 19 and a half. And males tend to want to go to bed later for longer. But from our early 20s, then there's a move to want to go to bed earlier and earlier and earlier. And by the time we're in our late 50s, early 60s, we're wanting to get up and go to bed at about the time we got up and went to bed pre-puberty, around about 10. And the difference is around about 2 hours. So somebody in their late teens, early 20s will want to go to bed on average 2 hours later than somebody in their late 50s and early 60s. So it's a big effect. What's driving it? Well, it's almost certainly the changes in the hormones associated with puberty, and then the change in concentration as we move into old age. So testosterone and estrogen. And we know from animal studies that these hormones can shift the rest activity cycles of mice, for example. In fact, the early work was all done in mice. So the first is genetics, the second is our development, but the third, which is, I think, so cool, and it's basically ignored most of the time, it's when we get exposure to light. So we said it was really important to get light to set the clock, but light has a different effect at different times. Dusk light delays the clock, means you want to go to bed later and get up later. Morning light advances the clock, means you want to go to bed earlier and get up earlier. Now, normally, when we're all agricultural workers, we got symmetrical exposure to both delaying dusk, advancing morning light. But that isn't always the case now. And so teenagers, for example, at the weekend, will invariably oversleep in the morning, not get the morning light, which would advance the clock, make them get up earlier, but they will be out later in the day in the evening towards dusk, and they get dusk light, which will delay the clock. And we did a study a few years ago showing that those delayed chronotypes were the ones that were getting the most evening light. So, three things: genetics, how old you are, and your sex steroidal milieu, and also if you're getting morning versus evening light. And actually, it's very interesting because, of course, it gives us some power over our chronotype. So if you need to be awake earlier in the day, then what you can do is set the alarm clock, get up, get outside, preferably to get bright natural light. But if it's winter, for example, you can sit in front of a light box. 30 minutes, 10,000 lux will advance the clock. So it's something that we have a bit of ownership over, and it's worth bearing in mind. Yeah. But that's in essence what defines our chronotype.
I want to talk a little bit about social media, actually, and this idea that the reason why teenagers are waking up later is potentially because of the use of their mobile phones at night. Now, I know you've got some views on this, that it might not be necessarily due to the light, but more so due to the content. And perhaps we could talk about the spectrum of light as well that we have indoors versus outdoors.
It's really important because there are, embedded in the media is the concept that blue light at night from computer screens and Kindles and all the rest of it is delaying the circadian clock. Remember, nighttime light delays the clock. The evidence for that is scant at best. A classic study that was undertaken by a group at Harvard got people to look at a Kindle on its brightest intensity for 4 hours on 5 consecutive nights. And after 5 nights,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, it's a brutal hit. After 5 nights with
Yeah.
that sort of experience, sleep time was just statistically significantly delayed by 10 minutes. And as Mary Caskadon, I think said at the time, well, it may be statistically significant, but it's biologically meaningless. It's within the wobble. Now, the problem with and while we're talking about it, computer screens and the shift from sort of a blue enriched to sort of a red enriched screen. There's very little evidence that works at all in terms of the circadian system. And it really goes back to our understanding of how light interacts with the clock. You need a lot of light of a long duration to actually shift the clock. So, for example, light treatments use 10,000 lux for 30 minutes. The sorts of light you're getting from a Kindle is going to be 30 lux. And from a computer screen, it's probably going to be something like maybe 70 lux, 100 lux if you're lucky. and I remember talking to a teenager, this great story, about the use of screens at night. And he said, okay, just stop right there, because I have a device which shifts the color of my screen from blue to orange, and therefore I'm not going to shift my circadian rhythms. I said, okay, that's great. There's not much evidence that it really works very well. But by the way, what time do you think you're getting off to sleep? And he said, well, about 2:30 a.m. So, there's this idea that you can actually dodge the bullets with technology, but actually you're not. And so, I think the danger, and where we do have good data with devices, and particularly devices that you're interacting with, they have an alerting effect upon the brain and they delay sleep onset.
Yeah.
And particularly if you're doing multimedia, you're doing your emails, you're doing your WhatsApps and all the rest of it. It's a highly dynamic, very brain alerting. And I think really what you've got to do is turn the devices off, at least 30 minutes before you want to go to sleep. And if you don't have the strength to not turn them back on if you wake up, leave them in another room. I mean, I do know what it's like. I remember when I first got a BlackBerry. I was in Western Australia, and those of us that remember this sort of little light that would flash slowly when a message. And so I was in Australia, so I deal with the Australian, emails and stuff. And then, of course, the European ones would come in. And then, of course, the American ones would come in. So, it spanned. And I sort of got there. I had jet lag. It was difficult to get to sleep. And I thought, okay, well, I'll put the BlackBerry in the next room. Woke up, wandered into the next room. In the end, I had to leave this damn thing in the lab because I had no control over looking at this thing. And so I do speak with experience. I do know how difficult it is, but actually leaving it in the lab worked. I'd wake up, I'd then fall back to sleep again.
Yeah, definitely. So rather than the light emitted from these devices, from what I gather, it's more the attention or the alerting effect of the content that you're consuming, and the attention switching between different applications and tasks that can be alerting to the brain.
Absolutely. And I think, and it will depend upon the device. So, for example, a Kindle, we've got the data, which suggests it's not going to delay sleep onset. And a Kindle is kind of one dimensional. It's an electronic book. You're not, you're reading. The sort of a smartphone or gaming or something else is very different in that it's a much more dynamic and complex set of interactions, which is going to be more alerting. So I think it's those electronic devices which I think one has to be particularly careful about in terms of their alerting effects because of what you're doing on the brain and therefore delaying sleep.
So shift workers, it's not going to go away. It's going to be a part of frontline workers' life in medicine and in supermarkets, lorry drivers, etc., etc. What kind of things can we do to mitigate the effect, the inevitable disruption that these entail? I mean, it's a very difficult question. Perhaps we could draw down into some of the processes that are actually disturbed as a result of shift work before we provide some solutions.
Yeah. I mean, we touched on this within the context of sort of higher frequency health checks, the appropriate
Yeah.
nutrition, education. One idea which I think is really interesting, and it sounds a bit crazy, but I think it's worth thinking about. We talked about chronotype, and so wouldn't it be smart to chronotype the workforce, and those who were the morning types would do the morning shifts, those that were the late chronotypes did the late shifts. What you really want to avoid is somebody like me, who's a late type, doing the morning shift, and vice versa. So I think that we can actually use one's chronotype to try and match onto the sorts of shift schedule that you would want to try. And it's not the whole solution, but it will mitigate to some extent. So I think that those approaches are really important. They're not going to get rid of the problems, but they will mitigate some of the problems, and not least the educational component. I think that the various sectors, warning, that knowledge, for junior doctors, for example, that 57% have either had a crash or a near miss on the drive home. So how can you deal with that information? And as we said, looking at devices which detect drowsiness and alert you to the fact that you're falling asleep at the wheel. And these microsleeps that you mentioned, Rupi, they're uncontrollable. You're going along, you think you're okay, and then you just fall asleep uncontrollably. And of course, that's why they're so dangerous, because you've lost any consciousness, and so you can't even put the brake on when you're ploughing into the car in front of you or into the middle of the road, because you've lost consciousness, and that's why they're so very dangerous in terms of causing severe trauma and indeed death.
Yeah, and so with sleep disruption, you have poor immune health, higher cortisol levels, greater risks of cardiovascular disease, etc. One of the elements, one of the things that I think is getting a bit more attention these days is the impact on mental health. So I wonder if we can do a bit of a dive into how sleep disruption can relate to mental health in either an associative role or in a potentially causative manner.
Yeah, I think the relationship between sleep and circadian rhythm disruption and mental health is very, very important. And I mentioned those studies right at the beginning that I did with colleagues on schizophrenia, and I was just completely gobsmacked at the appalling sleep-wake problems. And of course, the longevity of people with severe mental illness is much reduced. And what do they have? They have obesity, diabetes 2, cognitive problems, and these are all the sorts of things that you get as a result of chronic sleep disruption. And it's never thought about as a treatment option. The poor sleep. It's thought of as, well, an unavoidable consequence of antipsychotics, for example, or lack of employment. And again, I think this is not the right way to think about it. And so we sort of developed a sort of a conceptual model, because everybody said, well, is it chicken and egg? Is the sleep problem, causing the mental health, and the mental health? It's actually, you shouldn't look at it in that way. Because of our increased understanding of how the sleep and circadian systems are generated, they involve all those key brain neurotransmitter systems, multiple brain structures. So the hypothesis is that the heart of the problem is an overlap between the brain circuits, the neurotransmitter systems that are regulating mental health, and those that are regulating normal sleep-wake. And if there's a change in a neurotransmitter pathway that predisposes you to mental illness, let's say serotonin, let's say dopamine, whatever, it's going to have an impact upon the sleep-wake system at some level. And what evidence do we have for that? Well, it's been so interesting, because genes that have been linked to human schizophrenia, for example, SNAP25, we looked at a mouse with a mutation in SNAP25, which shows sort of odd. Mice can't have schizophrenia, but it shows some patterns of behavior which you can associate with schizophrenia. But what's its sleep-wake like? Well, it's smashed, completely smashed, just like the patients. And increasingly, we're finding genes which have been originally associated with the clock, which are now being linked to mental health issues, and mental health genes which are now been shown to have a role in the circadian and the sleep system. So there is that mechanistic overlap at the beginning. Okay, but it's more than that. Because, of course, the distorting effect of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption on our physiology and our cognitive behaviors and our emotional pathways will exacerbate the mental health condition. And, of course, the mental health condition will then feed back, let's say via anxiety, psychosocial stress, maybe even the medications can feed back and then affect the sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. So and of course, you have this stuff at the heart, but very rapidly you can, as a result of a positive feedback loop, distort both the worsening sleep situation and the worsening mental health situation. So that's the conceptual framework that we came up with. And we thought, okay, well, if that's the case, do you see changes in sleep-wake prior to a, let's say, depressive episode? And you do. And what about those individuals who are at risk from developing bipolar? So working with Guy Goodwin, Guy had developed a bunch of questionnaires about vulnerability to develop bipolar. And we were able to show that those young people who were at risk of developing bipolar but did not have a clinical diagnosis of bipolar were already showing sleep-wake problems. So again, further evidence for this relationship. And so anyway, the explicit test was, and this was led by Dan Freeman in psychiatry in Oxford, wonderful set of experiments, and using a digital cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia program, and looked at thousands of individuals. And these individuals are showing insomnia and high levels of paranoia, and hallucinatory experiences. And what was extraordinary is that by just partially stabilizing the sleep-wake cycle with digital, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, it was able to reduce the levels of paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. And so I think we can think about the sleep circadian system as a new therapeutic target in mental health. Stabilize that, and you'll hopefully reduce the severity of symptoms. And there will be a number of ways, of course, approaches that you could use to stabilize sleep-wake in those groups. But I think it's really fascinating. The other thing that I think is so important, and I've been talking to a tech company about this, is I've long had the idea that because you see a change in sleep-wake prior to a depressive episode or a psychotic episode, you could use a very simple device that would measure when you got up, when you went to bed, how many times you woke up in the middle of the night. And if you see a change in that, it signals to your smartphone, and that then goes to a clinical individual who can then ring up the individual and say, how's it going? Noticed some changes in your sleep-wake. Do you want to come in? Should we think about, do you find that your mental health status is sliding? Do we need to so you can then very light touch monitor individuals who are vulnerable within the community and try and head off a mental health crisis by looking at changes in the sleep-wake pattern. And I think that's potentially very exciting. We don't have that. Nobody's built the device. It's simple technology. It could be done now. And I hope this group will do it finally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the subject of health anxiety, particularly when people read and hear about the importance of sleep to all the different elements that we've discussed here, mental well-being, metabolic health. We've spoken on the podcast actually before about the timing of food as well, and how that can impact your propensity towards glucose excursions, etc. What would you say are some of the key things that people need to get right without sounding too puritanical about things? People have lots of struggles, and sleep, as you've mentioned a number of times here, is a very much a dynamic process. What are the key things that you think we should be thinking about, listeners should be thinking about, in terms of optimizing or giving ourselves the best chance at having this restorative sleep that is super important for us?
It's a really important point, because I think so many people feel that the sleep is what you get and they have no control over it. but actually very simple tricks, if you like, can improve our sleep. And I think we can think about this in 4 domains: what we do during the day, what we do before bed, what we do in the bedroom, what we can do for the bedroom, and then when we've actually crawled into bed. So during the day, the most important thing for me is getting that morning light exposure, setting the internal clock to the external world. That will stabilize everything, physiology, and of course the sleep-wake cycle. Napping is often, if people are tired, I mean, the first point to make, if you need a nap, you're not getting enough sleep at night, but let's not be too prescriptive. If you're going to nap, and it's been shown that a 20-minute nap, but not longer, can actually improve your ability to function during the second half of the day. So the occasional nap is not a problem, but make sure it's not longer than 20 minutes. The problem with napping, we go back to our teenagers, is that our teenagers are getting very little sleep at night. They're dragged out of bed by their frustrated parents. Well, not all of them, but some of them. They struggle to school. Some actually, and I've talked to teachers, they're actually falling asleep on the desk at school. They then go home. They're chronically tired. Then they'll experience a 2-hour nap fairly close to bedtime. That pushes back the sleep pressure, meaning it's more difficult to get to sleep that night. And then you get into a vicious circle of longer naps, shorter nighttime sleep. So be careful about napping. Occasional short nap, not a problem. Exercise, again, not too close to bedtime, because that will increase core body temperature, and a drop in core body temperature has been associated with getting to sleep, and we'll come back to temperature in a moment. We've touched on food intake. Try and concentrate your main food intake morning, lunchtime, rather than lunchtime, evening, because of the increased chances of obesity, diabetes too, and the development of conditions such as obstructive sleep apnea, which are common in individuals who have put on weight. And of course, obstructive sleep apnea is when there's a cessation of breathing during the sleep episode. Essentially, the musculature of the throat has collapsed onto the airway, and you're suffocating. The brain realizes it's being deprived of oxygen, wakes you up, and then you have these incredible, surges in blood pressure, which can actually damage the small blood vessels within the eye, and it's a really important condition. Obstructive sleep apnea is associated with coronary heart disease and a whole range of other problems. So make sure you're not eating your main meal of the day only at night. Avoid excessive consumption of caffeine, for example. And there's a very interesting cycle that people can get locked into. What caffeine does is really interesting, because we talked about sleep pressure. Well, it actually blocks the receptors in the brain that are responding to some elements of sleep pressure. So there's a very interesting understanding of its physiological role. The problem is, of course, if you're fueling the waking day with lots and lots of caffeine, it means you're wired when you need to get to sleep. And so the first point is try not to drink coffee in the afternoon, or caffeinated coffee in the afternoon. And if you are drinking coffee throughout the day, then there's a tendency to reverse that stimulation with sedation. And so people will fall into a stimulant sedative feedback loop. And that sedative, the first choice, is alcohol. So many people will sedate themselves with alcohol. And it's really important to appreciate that sedatives, like alcohol, are sedatives. They mask some of the important things going on within the brain, such as memory formation and all the rest of it. So really try and avoid that sort of stimulant sedative feedback loop. Really important is, after a stressful day, step back, do something which detaches you from the stressful situation. The main enemy of sleep is stress. Many people don't have a sleep problem; they have a stress problem, which then prevents them getting the sleep that they're wired to get. So do step back. Before bed, keep the levels of light low, because that will increase levels of light. I think it's right, absolutely ironic. What's the last thing that we do before we go to bed? We stand in the most brightly lit room, the bathroom, looking into an illuminated mirror, cleaning our teeth. And again, maybe one of your listeners will actually build the ideal bathroom mirror which will have a switch. There'll be a morning setting with lots of bright light, increasing alertness, and then there'll be an evening setting, which will reduce the levels of light while you clean your teeth. We've touched on electronic devices. Stop using them at least 30 minutes before your desired bedtime, because they increase alertness and they reduce the chances of getting to sleep. We've talked about avoiding sedatives and prescription drugs. Short-term use, fine, but just be very careful that they don't become the way you try and induce a sleep-wake cycle, because they, and particularly in the elderly, and you'll know this, Rupi, with daytime sleepiness and the chances of falls because of sleeping issues induced by sedatives. Going back, and I think it's worth talking about, and there's the winding down at the end of the day, but it's also before bed is the time that many individuals, many couples, it's the only time that they have to talk about the important stuff going on. And so what you find is that people slide into really stressful conversations. I mean, I remember, that Lizzie, my wife, she'd want to discuss family finances, and I'd say, no, absolutely not. This is too terrifying. I don't want to, we'll make another time for it. And I think it's true. I mean, I'm sort of trivializing it a bit, but actually, if it's stuff that stresses you out, don't do it before you go to bed. And immediately before bed, you're adopting behaviours that relax you. It's sort of the book, or the music, or whatever activity you find relaxing. The bedroom itself shouldn't be too warm. There's some very dodgy practices in British bedrooms with really overheated bedrooms, and of course it shouldn't be cold, but it should be, you should be able to lose core body temperature to a slightly colder environment. Of course, it's difficult. Keep it quiet. Maybe white noise, or the sound of the sea if there's traffic noise, or you're in a flat with lots of other people around you. It's tricky. Keep it dark, again, particularly if there's light from the window outside, because light increases alertness. Make the bedroom a place for sleep, a haven for sleep. And again, I appreciate it's difficult, but remove TVs, computers, smartphones, just get them out. This should be this wonderful cocoon of where you go for your glorious sleep. Don't clock watch. So we've touched on waking up at night, and many people will wake up. Yep, it's the natural thing, but then they'll look at their illuminated dial and they think, oh my God, I've only got 2 hours left. I'm never going to get back to sleep. And it doesn't matter. Just cover the face of the damn thing up. And it's the alarm that you're dependent upon, not roughly how many hours or less you've got to sleep before you need to get up. We've touched on sleep apps. Don't take them too seriously. I mean, a bit of fun, but really use them judiciously. In bed, keep to a routine, both free days and work days. Try and keep that structure. And of course, it refers to other stuff. It's not only when you go to bed and when you get up, but also try and structure meal times. That can be useful as well. Considering that we spend more than 30% of our time in bed, we're really cheap in terms of our bedding and our pillows. I don't know what it is that resentment in spending a lot of money on a mattress or a pillow, but actually it really helps, and you should get the mattress and the pillows that enhance your sleep. There's some weird stuff going on there. There's some people use relaxing oils. Now, the evidence that these are actually useful isn't really very robust. It's probably having a placebo effect, but again, it's getting you into that. This is the bed. This is the air, the environment. I associate this smell with, now it's sleepy time. And incidentally, it can be very useful if you're doing a lot of traveling. You can have, your partner's perfume or aftershave, and it can be quite nice, because you essentially then define your space as the place to sleep. Earplugs. Now, this is important. So, if your partner snores, it's one of the major problems, and it gets worse as one gets older. And I think you need to take a pragmatic attitude towards it. If you don't like using earplugs, and many people don't, worth persevering, but many people don't like them. Find an alternative sleeping place. It's not a reflection on the nature of your relationship. It just means that one of you is not going to be woken up by snoring, and the other is not going to wake up with bruised ribs in the morning because you keep on sort of prodding them. The serious point about that, though, is that make sure your partner doesn't have obstructive sleep apnea. And this occurs both in men and women. It's more prevalent in men, but it does occur in women as well. So that's important. Now, clearly, economically, one doesn't often have the chance of an alternative sleeping space. But if it does, it is an option, and it's easier as one gets older. You're more likely to have the space. Then go for it. And the final bit, I suppose I'd say, is if you wake, stay calm. We've talked about polyphasic, biphasic sleep. You must almost certainly get back to sleep if you don't let stress, social media, and caffeine then blocking your ability to get back. But the key point of all of this rant, it's not really a rant, but all these tips, is that work out what works best for you, because everybody's going to be different, and you need to take some ownership of your sleep. And with very simple things, you can actually enhance it enormously.
Absolutely. I think it's far from a rant. It was full of incredible tips there. Do you use, I mean, I get often asked this question from a food point of view, what does your daily food intake look like? Do you ever eat junk food? Do you ever have cookies? Do you ever, all that kind of stuff? With the amount of knowledge that you've accrued over the last few years and the studies that you've done, how do you find your own sleep? Is it something that you still struggle with, or have you found your routine? I'm just trying to give the listeners something.
I'm unlucky. I get pretty reasonable sleep. I'm a late chronotype, and as one of the great advantages of becoming a full professor is you decide when the meetings will be. And they're damn well not going to be at 8 o'clock in the morning. I remember when I worked at Charing Cross Hospital. I mean, God, all of the clinical meetings would be at 8 o'clock in the morning. If you're commuting in, it was like getting up and crack of dawn, and it was hideous. So I'm now very lucky because I can decide when the meetings are. And of course, I work primarily with young people who are certainly younger than I am, and they tend to be later types anyway. So we meetings tend to start at 10. However, of course, we then go on later on in the day. So I've had the luxury, in a sense, to define my work schedule and what works for me, and that's rare, and I appreciate that. So I'm lucky in that sense. I do wake up in the middle of the night. I do stay calm. What I occasionally do is put Radio 4 Extra and listen to a 15-minute play or something like that, which I find I often don't get to the end of it, so I'll then try and listen back. A good friend of mine does exactly the same thing, and I hope Melvin Bragg isn't listening, but she says that Melvin Bragg is the best soporific on the planet. She said she's always asleep, which is a bit mean, but if it works. So yeah, but the eating, I mean, that's very tricky for many of us, because we lead busy lives. We have the commute. We have the breakdown of sort of all of the family structure, and so it's tempting to have the main meal of the day towards bedtime after you get back from work. But we have been better by eating much, much smaller meals, high protein, low carbs in the evening, and making a point of having breakfast and making a point of having lunch. And that's become more necessary as I've aged. But I remember as a student, I possibly would skip breakfast and lunch, and then because I had a great metabolism and I was swimming and doing all that kind of stuff, it didn't really matter. It does as you age, and so you've got to be a bit more sensible about it. However, having said that, our youngest has now moved back home from Australia, and she is a wonderful policeman, and encouraging us to keep our calorie load lighter in the evenings, and she joins us. It's great. Yeah.
Amazing.
So
That's so cool.
I get between 7 and 8 hours of sleep a night. I do wake up, but I invariably get back to sleep again. And I try and do the sorts of things that we've talked about. Blackout curtains, if there's any street lighting, and there is where I live. I try not to use alcohol, late as a sedative, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, your sleep tips are incredible, and I really think there is the potential for a brand to become like the Nike of sleep. Whether that's mattresses or something that spills into the digital world or pillows and that kind of stuff. I think that's
Well,
how we
I
get
think it's
like
really
mass
important.
adoption.
And in fact, because of that, I've agreed to be a consultant on a mattress manufacturing company. And I did it not just to lend my name to sales, but because they have a whole research unit and they're actually trying to find ways to build better mattresses, whether it's removing heat, from the mattress, whether it's enhancing comfort, whether it's enhancing, getting rid of allergens such as dust mites. So I think there are groups now which are taking this stuff kind of seriously and actually investing in research to make the sleeping space better. So I'm very happy to work with these guys, actually.
Brilliant. Well, I'll watch out for that. I'll be making a purchase maybe Christmas time for a new mattress.
Well, can I,
Great.
Rupi, now just if you have a dodgy mattress now, don't wait until Christmas time.
It's my stinginess coming out there.
Well, yeah, but
Brilliant.
it's funny. We all have that sort of streak of meanness. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I need to invest a bit more in self-care for sure. But this has been brilliant, Professor. I could chat to you for another hour. There's so many things that I had on my list to talk about, but this, I think we'll stop it there. But I would love to have you back on and talk to you about other elements
sure.
in the book, because you've talked about so many subjects and they're all absolutely fascinating. So yeah, brilliant work.
I mean, what we should talk about next time, I think, is chronopharmacology. I mean, the timing of drugs and how they interact with our biology is just becoming revolutionary. And I think that's going to be an incredibly important trend in the next 10, 20 years in medicine. But let's not talk about it now. We can do that next time, Rupi. That'll be fun.
If you enjoyed that video, you'll love the library of content that we have on thedoctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.